for a Labour government. Nigel Farage responded to your plans saying you sound like a reform supporter. How does that make you feel?
Because he's making mischief, so I'm not going to let him live rent-free in my head. And just because he said something doesn't mean to say that I have to respond to it just because he's making...
Nigel Farage just said Labour's Home Secretary sounds like a reform supporter, which would be a compliment if he hadn't immediately followed it up by declaring that her reforms won't survive contact with either the courts or her own backbenchers. Meanwhile, Labour's about to unveil what they're calling the most radical asylum reforms since World War II. The Conservatives are saying it's not radical enough, left-wing Labour MPs are calling it a moral dead end, and everyone agrees that small boats are still going to keep coming regardless. Welcome to British migration policy in 2025, where everyone has strong opinions, nobody agrees on solutions, and the only certainty is that whatever gets announced tomorrow will satisfy absolutely no one. Right, let's break down what's actually being proposed. For years, the ECHR is being exploited by human rights lawyers to prevent the deportation of people who absolutely should be deported. It's a remarkable admission that suggests Labour's finally realized that ideological purity doesn't help when you're trying to run a country. The reforms include new legislation to change how British judges balance Article 8 of the ECHR, which is the right to a family life, with the rights of British citizens to live free from violence and criminality. Currently, judges are finding that they can't enforce deportations because Article 8 gets weaponized by clever lawyers who argue that removing someone would interfere with their family life. Never mind that the person in question might be a serious criminal whose presence in Britain is far more harmful than their removal would be. The law as it currently stands gives more weight to the criminal's right to stay than to the public's right to safety. Labour's also planning to reform modern slavery laws, which have similarly been abused. Under the new proposals, anyone crossing the channel would have to make any modern slavery appeal immediately, not months or years into the process. Currently, people make these claims as a last-ditch effort to avoid deportation, often long after they've arrived, and it gums up the entire system with cases that take forever to process. So, on paper, these reforms sound quite substantial. They're addressing real problems with how the current system operates. They're acknowledging that certain laws are being exploited, and they're promising to speed up the entire process. If you're someone who thinks Britain's migration system is broken, which basically everyone does regardless of their political views, you might think this is progress. But here's where it gets messy, because absolutely nobody is happy with these proposals. The Conservatives say they don't go far enough. Reform UK says they won't survive legal challenges. Left-wing Labour MPs are furious that their party is adopting right-wing talking points, and even supporters are skeptical that any of this will actually work. Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp's response is basically, nice try, but the only real solution is leaving the ECHR entirely. He argues that tinkering around the edges, which is what he claims Labour is doing, won't solve anything. In his view, as long as Britain remains part of the ECHR, human rights lawyers will find ways to exploit it to keep foreign criminals in the country. The only way to truly restore control over Britain's borders is to withdraw from the treaty completely, damn the consequences. It's a characteristically blunt conservative position that has the benefit of internal logic, even if the practical implications would be enormous. Leaving the ECHR would indeed give British courts more freedom to deport people without worrying about European human rights protections. It would also potentially put Britain in the company of Russia and Belarus as the only European countries outside the convention, which might not be the best diplomatic look. Nigel Farage's response is even cutting because it's dressed up as agreement. He says Mahmood sounds like a reform supporter, which seems like praise until you realize he's saying she's talking the talk, but won't be able to walk the walk. His prediction is that the reforms won't survive either court challenges or opposition from Labour's own backbenchers, which is a pretty devastating assessment. He's essentially saying Labour has diagnosed the problem correctly, but prescribed medicine that won't actually cure anything. And honestly, he might not be wrong. Labour's backbenchers are already in revolt, with MPs briefing journalists that the reforms represent a moral dead end and accuse the government of imitating the fear on the right. These aren't fringe voices, these are mainstream Labour MPs who think their party has betrayed its values by even acknowledging that migration needs to be controlled more strictly. The split in Labour is fascinating because it reveals a fundamental tension between the party's traditional values and the practical realities of governing. Left-wing Labour MPs believe that Britain has a moral obligation to be as open and welcoming as possible to asylum seekers and migrants, and that any restrictions are playing into right-wing narratives about immigration being a problem. Meanwhile, the government is looking at polling numbers, talking to voters, and realizing that their base wants borders controlled and rules enforced. Shabana Mahmood has tried to square this circle by pointing out that she's the child of migrants herself, giving her moral authority to tackle the issue without accusations of racism or xenophobia. She's framed tackling record-high small boat crossings as a moral mission, arguing that the current situation is tearing our country apart. It's an attempt to reclaim the moral high ground from both the left-wing critics, who think any restrictions are immoral, and the right-wing critics, who think Labour is too soft. But it's an incredibly difficult needle to thread. If you're too tough, your own backbenchers rebel and accuse you of abandoning Labour values. If you're not tough enough, voters punish you for failing to control borders, and the opposition attacks you as weak. Labour's trying to find a middle path that satisfies enough people to be politically sustainable, but middle paths on migration are notoriously difficult to maintain. Tory leader Kemi Badenoch has already warned that Starmer will likely fold under pressure from hard left backbenchers, which is both a prediction and a strategy. By saying it publicly, she's making it harder for Labour to compromise with their left wing without looking weak. She's also offered to work with Mahmood to guarantee Conservative votes for the package, which is clever politics because it puts Labour in a bind. If they accept Tory support, they're implicitly admitting their own MPs won't back them. If they reject it, they risk the reforms failing to pass. The really frustrating part about all of this is that nobody seems to think the reforms will actually solve the small boat problem. The Conservatives say you need to leave the ECHR. Reform UK says the courts will block everything. Left-wing Labour MPs are horrified, and even supporters are hedging their bets by saying implementation will take years and require European cooperation. Speaking of which, Labour is hoping to push for cross-Europe reform to Article 3 of the ECHR, which deals with preventing inhumane and degrading treatment. They're arguing the definition has expanded beyond what's reasonable and needs to be reined in, which is probably true, but good luck getting dozens of European countries to agree on changes to a fundamental human rights treaty. That process could take years, potentially longer than Labour's time in government, and requires cooperation from countries with very different views on migration. So what we're really looking at here is a package of reforms that Labour hopes will show voters they're serious about controlling migration, that might make practical improvements to how the current system operates, that are acknowledging that certain laws are being exploited, and they're promising to speed up the entire process. If you're someone who thinks Britain's migration system is broken, which basically everyone does regardless of their political views, you might think this is progress. But here's where it gets messy, because absolutely nobody is happy with these proposals. The Conservatives say they don't go far enough, Reform UK says they won't survive legal challenges, left-wing Labour MPs are furious that their party is adopting right-wing talking points, and even supporters are skeptical that any of this will actually work. As last minute whatever gets announced tomorrow will satisfy absolutely no one. The make-or-break framing is interesting because it suggests Labour knows how high the stakes are. If these reforms fail, if small boats keep coming in record numbers, if deportations don't increase significantly, then Labour's credibility on one of voters' top concerns evaporates entirely. They'll have admitted the ECHR is being exploited, proposed reforms to address it, and still failed to deliver results. That's a disaster scenario that could doom them at the next election.
But if they go too far, if they alienate their own backbenchers and split the party, that's equally disastrous. Labour's trying to thread an impossibly narrow path between being tough enough to satisfy voters and moderate enough to keep their party together. The fact that they're drawing on Denmark's approach is telling, because Denmark has implemented some of the strictest migration policies in Europe while still maintaining its progressive credentials in other areas. Labour's hoping to pull off the same trick. The problem is that Denmark is a small, relatively homogeneous country with different political dynamics and legal structures than Britain. What works there might not translate directly to the UK context, especially with Britain's complex relationship with human rights law and its historical role in international refugee protection.